This is Andrij with the Boston Global Forum. Tonight we're talking about Ukraine crisis. We have a few guests with us. One is Andrij Dobriansky from the Ukrainian Committee Congress of America. We've got Ivan Rodichenko from the 25th Volunteer Battalion in Ukraine. And we have Mr. Robert Whitcomb, who is a journalist. He's worked for many publications, including his own New England Diary. Let's start with Ivan. Ivan's fresh from the field in Ukraine. Ivan, what is going on with your volunteer battalion right now in Ukraine?
Okay, great to see you. I will speak Ukrainian, and Andrij will translate me. Переклади, будь ласка, питання, Андрій.
Що зараз тепер діється з батальйоном в Україні?
Ти мається на увазі штаб, да? Та здання Генштабу чи...
Ні, ваш самий батальйон. Що діється з батальйоном?
Та сьогоднішній час батальйон поніс дуже важкі втрати під Дебальцевим. Із 600 чоловік на сьогоднішній час залишилося 200. Із мого підрозділу та розвідки, коли було 40, залишилося 7 чоловік. Це був...
Okay, so the battalion was involved in the conflict in the Baltova. Of the close to 600 men that were involved in that conflict, only 200 remains as part of the battalion proper right now, and of the 40-man platoon that he was essentially a part of, that is down to скільки чоловік в платоні?
Було 40 і залишилося 7.
It went down from 40 men to 7.
Всі інші постраждали в самому Дебальцеві за цей час і при самому підступу із-под Дебальцева.
And all of the losses were incurred in the Battle of Debaltseve.
По моїй інформації, зараз я контактував з хлопцями, наш батальйон вийшов із-под Дебальцева. Змогли вибратися майже всі. Є лише інформація, що перша рота, порядка 40 хлопців, залишалися в Дебальцево. Але на сьогоднішній час вже йдуть другі сутки, коли батальйони і ВСУ, ТСУ, Збройні Сили України відступають. Майже на 90% батальйони були виведені і війська з Дебальцева на сьогоднішню хвилину.
As the retreat began in the news, we heard that there were numbers between 50 and 70 who were moving out yesterday. His battalion in and of itself was not fully evacuated, those that remain up until today. And there was one division within the battalion that was still remaining there as of yesterday. They have now been evacuated. So when you hear the numbers, about 90% of the Ukrainian armed forces who were involved in the battle have now exited Debaltseve.
So Ivan, this sounds like for your battalion. Are you saying there were that many deaths in the battalion at you guys have had some casualties?
Більше постраждали. Кожен другий має контузію. І це постраждали ті, хто були відправлені у госпіталь.
So he's saying these are the people who remain as a fighting force. So it's down from a 600-man force down to 200. That includes losses as well as people who have been infirmed. And for his platoon, 7 men who can still take part in actions.
Я розповім, що російські війська, вони використовували дуже потужну артилерію та танки. І дуже багато серед батальйону були контузені. Це контузія. Кожен другий військовий – це важка контузія. Іноді є такі постраждали, що зовсім з глузду з'їхали, зараз у шпиталях, і мені доклали, що дуже важкі контузії, люди просто з'їхали з глузду.
So the reporting from his battalion, and it reflects on the other armed forces of Ukraine who were in Debaltseve, that the artillery was very heavy, that was being used to shell Debaltseve to drive them out. So the injuries are to the point where a lot of people are shell-shocked, not in the PTSD sense, but frankly can't even remember their name, he's saying, as well as having physical lacerations that just won't allow them to leave the hospital.
So, if I can just get it clear, in the past, since the ceasefire, how many deaths has the battalion suffered?
Скільки загинули з батальйону в Дебальцеві?
За цей час, коли було, да, перемир'я з цього підпису. Ну, по-перше, я відповім, що ніякого перемир'я не відбулося. Це перше.
Yeah. Well, he's saying that if you're talking about how many people passed away since the ceasefire, he wants to make clear that his battalion never experienced a ceasefire. So he just wants to put that out there.
Right.
Деякого перемир'я, взагалі, Андрій, я хочу ще сказати, що якщо політично, то нічого не відбулося. І сепаратисти та російські війська порушили ті угоди. З часу, коли Путін підлітав до Росії, ніхто, і коли вступили перемовини, коли Порошенко взагалі об'явив, що ми вводимо перемир'я, вони не прекратили жодного разу пострілу, постійно відбувалися.
And he's underlining this not when they were talking in Minsk, not when Putin was flying back to Moscow, not when the Ukrainian president was traveling, not when there were declarations made that a ceasefire was signed. As far as his battalion reports, there was never a cessation of fire on their position in Debaltseve.
І також загинуло. Тут дуже важко порахувати зараз, але я думаю, що в Дебальцево ми маємо великі втрати.
He doesn't have the exact numbers of deaths right now because it's hard to. They know who's not there, but they don't know who's been captured. They don't know who's stuck in Debaltseve still. So, in terms of accurate death numbers, he doesn't have that because it's just been a day since the rest of the remaining ones have left.
Тому ми отримуємо найближчим часом інформацію, котру будемо. Ну, я ще раз підкреслюю, що ми в цьому бої і при цьому підступі ми, я думаю, багато втрапили.
But he believes that there was a significant loss of life amongst all Ukrainian service members who were stationed there.
And where are most of the people who escaped? Where are they now?
Де більшість українських сил тепер що вийшли? Де вони поїхали?
Зараз війська відступили, багато поранених привозять до Дніпропетровська, до Артемовська. Багато війська продовжують виходити. Вони підійшли колонами, по центру йшли вантажівки, і по боках їх супроводжували танки. Зараз як вони підійшли, вони вистроювалися вночі, без фар, без світла. Зараз вже вони розташувалися багато по трасі, багато хто ще виходить зараз. Багато вояків йдуть пішки. І вони по цій, виходить, трасі зараз і колони.
Okay, so the injured are being taken first and foremost towards Dnipropetrovsk, to the hospitals there. Also to Artemivsk, which is closer, but not as large a medical facility. There are still, he's saying there are still people who are walking out. When his battalion evacuated, they walked out under cover of night without any lights on. The bulk of the forces went out with the support of their tanks flanking the trucks which the men were on. However, towards the end of the withdrawal and still continuing on now, more people are exiting on foot until they come to a checkpoint where they can check in and then see where they will be redeployed.
І я підкреслюю, що вийшли вони, коли вони виходили з Дебальцевого, майже колона натрапила з першої хвилини, як вони почали виходити, під шквальний обстріл. І продовжувалося, коли війська наші йшли, вони були під дуже важким обстрілом російських військ. Їх били, майже розбивали дуже багато, кидали вантажівки, дуже багато з колон. Перші машини прорвалися 100 з піхотою, інші дуже багато залишилися машини з людьми, і дуже було багато поранених, дуже було багато вбили, яких залишали на землі і не могли з собою забирати вбитих, але просто залишали і бігли.
So the evacuation was not a calm event. The first column that left the city got hammered pretty hard. His battalion itself was under fire from both sides when they were leaving. A lot of people, unfortunately, were shot dead in the evacuation, and the rest of the troops had to leave the bodies there behind because they were under such immense fire. He doesn't know if those bodies have been recovered yet, but it was not an evacuation that was that a ceasefire observed.
It was not an orderly evacuation.
It was not an orderly, but it was a hot evacuation from a hot zone.
Це був відступ, да, це був дійсно відступ, і ми, виходить, отримали команду за 10 хвилин. Ніхто не знав, всі були на позиціях. За 10 хвилин був приказ терміново взяти з собою тільки ті речі для бою, все інше залишили на позиціях, взяли необхідні речі, набої, що потрібно в бою для відступу. І це, да.
They were given, his particular group of men were given 10 minutes to evacuate their positions. Take only what you need in terms of being on your feet to fight man on man. Leave all other equipment behind. But they were given 10 minutes to do this.
І це був відступ, не як сьогодні сказали, що він був спланований там і зорганізований. Багато коли почався обстріл, і всі почали, хто по полях, хто де. Тобто, тому сказати, що це був спланований відход українських військ, це був відступ.
So in contrast to the news stories today about an organized retreat, it certainly wasn't that. There was certainly a lot of fire against them. They weren't given a lot of warning, and it wasn't an organized evacuation.
Right. I think it is important for viewers to get some sort of a sense of what your battalion experience is in terms of the risks involved. So if you can think back to how many hundreds of men have fought in the battalion since it began? When did it begin?
Коли батальйон створився?
Червні? Да, червень.
It started in June of 2014. It was when they first started getting together. That's when they began their training of 2 months.
Yeah. And how many men have fought, men and women?
Скільки включно, то було понад 600 чи тільки до 600? Чи додали ще?
По-перше, додали. Сформовано було десь 400 чоловік набрано. Це були більша частина батальйону була, як і комбат сам, це люди з Майдану. Хто воював на Майдані, це сотні. Це було дуже багато людей, хто стояв на Майдані. Та активістів. Це був добровольчий батальйон.
So it was a volunteer battalion that got together in June of 2014. The first people who entered it, for the most part, were people who met each other on the Maidan. They were self-defenders on the Maidan, and that was about 400 men that came together in June of 2014. But there were additions after that. Скільки тоді додали?
І потім ми in September
Так,
ми зробили ще одну роту огнівої підтримки. 200 чоловік. Додали, це був наприкінці березня.
Okay, so at the end of September, they added another 200 men, bringing it to almost a full complement of 600 men for the battalion.
Right, and then over that time, how many of your battalion members have actually died?
З цього початку бою в вересні чи в серпні скільки загинули?
Загинуло в батальйони, загинуло приблизно за цей час, да?
До цього часу.
До цього часу. Ну, мабуть, приблизно, я можу сказати, приблизно 20-30 чоловік майже
Тільки 30?
Так, тільки 30. Інші всі поранені є, і різні інші. Ну це завдяки, у нас дуже добрий комбат. І один з цих комбатів, котрий піклується про людей. Тому він старався, дуже піклувався за всім. Це дуже добра людина. І тому завдяки його діям вдалося зберегти життя людей. Може десь 20-30 тільки загинуло, а інші були поранені в разному степені.
He doesn't have accurate figures, but in terms of deaths, it's actually been very reasonable. It's only been 30 deaths that they have recorded up to this time. Again, not including what happened in Debaltseve in terms of not knowing how many people actually died. The vast other majority of people who are now not a part of are the enormous amount of injuries that the battalion has incurred. So that has claimed more than that amount of people out of the battalion. And he'd like to take this moment to praise his commander because he feels that the commander of the 25th Volunteer Battalion is heads and shoulders above others in the fact that he keeps his men alive.
Yes. What casualties has the battalion suffered over that period?
Ті, що загинули, як вони загинули? Чи розстрілювали, чи ракетами?
Багато загинуло від мінометних обстрілів, від осколків, від градів. Також теж десь 30% загинуло від снайперів. 20-30%. Тобто я знаю ті, хто десь чоловіка 4-5 загинули дійсно від снайперів. Дуже багато діяли російські снайпери.
So he's putting 20 to 30%. Maybe he knows for a fact about 5 of his men were shot by snipers. The majority of deaths though by heavy artillery and rocket fire, the Grad rockets, etc.
Дуже несподівано, коли було перемир'я, да, як ми його називали, то, звісно, нас, виходить, обстрілювали кожного ранку. Кожен день, да, артилерія. Ну, вони застосовували, звичайно, така зброя, це були міномети. Да, от часто дуже більше загибель була від осколків.
Yeah, so again, he's emphasizing the majority of deaths are from artillery fire that came out of nowhere normally, and especially during this quote-unquote ceasefire time, where every morning they were reporting that they experienced rocket fire on their positions on a regular basis.
Right. Now I've put up a map of Debaltseve and the surrounding area. The map on the left is the rebel area or lines about a week ago, and now the current situation. Can you tell us why Debaltseve is so important?
Уже зараз, на сьогоднішній час, вже ці лінії, вони повністю відійшли, і вони вирівняли, це перше. Да, вже
first of all, the very latest is the fact that there is no bubble here that comes in. It's a solid line now. There is no enclave of Ukrainian territory. So that has been, it's a solid line now where that kind of bubble bursts into the occupied territory. Now, you're asking about where they're heading next, or why is it important?
Where they're defending
Why is
and
it
why was Debaltseve so important to the rebels?
Я можу зараз тебе говорити, чи ти хочеш?
Я можу відповісти, трошки про те, що дуже багато є питань до керівників Генштабу, да? І ці позиції, коли, дійсно це йде війна за позиційні за території, да? Втративши Дебальцево, ми втратили українську територію. Це по-перше. Особливо для мене, як для військового, може у мене недостатньо фаху, да, ну, для мене такого стану, якби Дебальцевого, як щось таке як критично важливе, я не бачу. Це тільки територія. Для якогось, там, звісно, для якогось наступу, це теж. Тому це війна, як було в аеропорту, по-перше, в Донецькому, коли стояли кіборги, і хлопці ми тримали, потім відійшли і сказали з Генштабу, що нам це не було, що він вже не має сенсу, тому що аеропорт був зруйнований. У мене дуже багато питань до Генерального штабу. Взагалі потрібно ли були ці жертви, чи можливо було підійти раніше. Тому для мене, да, це моя думка особлива. Якогось статусу, крім позиційної війни, показати, от ми тримаємо, і ми воюємо, і Україна не здасть жодного кілометра своїй землі. Це це я підтримую, що якщо уступати, це програвати, як Черчилль сказав.
So in his mind, in Ivan's mind, and in what he talks about with the rest of the battalion back in Ukraine, is that there is a sense on the ground from the soldiers that they didn't really understand why Debaltseve was chosen as a position. Primarily, the question is, why would you choose that if it's not that easy to defend? The other question is, it brings back to mind the loss of the Ukrainian airport in Donetsk, where Ukrainian volunteers were fighting for months, and many lives were lost in that. And then when the decision came from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry to pull back, those people who were then pulled out of there were told that that position really wasn't important for them, and that they feel that kind of detracts from the lives who were actually lost. Now, the thing about it is, you have to, from the mind of a soldier, and what Ivan talks about with the rest of the battalion is either you stay with the location and make it a point of doing that, or you don't take it to begin with. You don't stay there and make a big deal that you're defending something if you're saying in the end that you didn't need to defend it in the first place. It is an important area. If you see a lot of the roadways right now, I see on the map. The more important thing about Debaltseve is the fact that it's a railroad crossing. It's a railroad crossing in the sense that it connects lines that are coming through the Luhansk and the Donetsk Oblast from the Russian territory. So if you want to, I would like to explain it from the New York subway point of view, where you kind of have to go from one borough to the next, but you can't go from borough to borough. In the same way, you can't take a train from the Donetsk to Luhansk territory without making that connection in Debaltseve. So if you're bringing in goods from one part of Russia through the Luhansk territory, you're going to connect in Debaltseve, and then you're going to take another train that goes into the rest of the Donetsk territory. And so that's important on the Russian side for making those areas viable in terms of shipping the goods, the sources, the raw material that they take out, specifically the coal, and then transport it up into Russia. Now, from the Ukrainian side, it's also important because just as it's a hub for those areas in Luhansk and Donetsk and going on into Russia, it's also a hub the other way as well. So if you want to connect something coming from the Dnipropetrovsk area and down to Mariupol, you're going to want to use that connection as well to go northwest towards Kiev and other parts. So it's that primarily was a big thing that it was being fought over.
Is this a useful place from which to invade further west?
Тепер, що маєте, тепер, що має Дебальцеве, чи то легше їм далі піти? Чи...
Ну так, зараз бойовики підуть, на мою думку, да, і як розвідників, і я спілкувався з фахівцями сьогодні, мав розмову зі своєї розвідки. Ми вважаємо, що наступний крок це Маріуполь. І зараз ми сьогодні бачимо атаки на Маріуполь. Біля Маріуполя, село Щастя та інші, аеропорт Піски, вони кинуть всі сили і будуть йти до Маріуполя. Це на нашу думку. І вони не будуть зупинятись.
So this is going back and forth between the north side of this occupied territory and the south side. Right before Debaltseve was heavily attacked, we had that feint of rocket fire hitting Mariupol, and a lot of civilians being killed in that. But instead of marching on to Mariupol, they went on to Debaltseve. In Ivan's estimation, what's now that Debaltseve has been secured, and again I mentioned that railroad, so now that that important crossing is secured, now he thinks that they're going to return on taking Mariupol. And why he says that is that in the last 24 hours we have had rocket fire attack Mariupol. There's a village called Szczastie, which is in the outskirts of that city, and that's received shelling. There's been maybe 50 reported rocket shellings over the last 12 hours, and as important as Debaltseve was for a railroad crossing, Mariupol represents the major seaport, commercial seaport, on the east side of the Ukrainian Black Sea. So once you control Mariupol, not so much as the military port that was important on Crimea, but Mariupol is where you have your commercial goods traffic out from there onto the rest of the
the Russians could use that to connect with Crimea.
It's true as well. It's true as well. Yeah.
You're right. Yeah. Exactly.
Could use that to incorporate the entire area.
Я хотів ще додати, що Росія за ці часи на Луганську, ну, та Донецьку, вони зробили дуже потужну армію. І зараз за ці сутки і за ці 2 дні після підпису Мінських угод очередних, вони безперервно посилали на Україну техніку. Були дуже багато перетин кордону. І зараз вони мають дуже потужну армію. Зараз біля Дебальцева сконцентрована порядка 30-тисячна армія, руська армія. Там воювали, не як Путін сказав, трактористи та селяни. Там воювала професійна російська армія. Загони, спецзагони, тому що вони діяли скоординовано, вони мали зв'язок, вони дуже добре діяли. Тому зараз там велика армія. І вони її, напевно, це моя думка і думка інших фахівців, що це вони перекинуть у напрямку Маріуполя. Як ви дуже гарно, вірно сказали, тому що пробивати коридор до Криму.
So what Ivan wants to make clear is that the intelligence on the ground is, over the last several months, the fighting forces that have been assembled in these occupied territories are really formidable. You know, upwards of 33,000 combining these militants as well as Russian forces. Really, these are not minors, as Putin had in a speech the other day that defeated Ukraine. These are really getting to a level of, especially with the equipment that they have, a formidable force for Ukraine to be dealing with. And especially during that area, not only were they formidable up to this point, but once the ceasefire was signed, we had an enormous amount of border crossings from Russia of both tanks, heavy artillery, rocket systems coming in. So not only was it formidable to begin with, now it's been even more reinforced. And that's why he feels that Mariupol is going to be a target and that the fighting won't stop with Debaltseve.
What percentage of the troops are Russian?
Скільки відсотків є російські, є росіяни, і найомники, і всі інші?
Так, я вам сьогодні я написав у своєму Фейсбуці, яка є формула гібридної війни. Значить, першим ешелоном, коли йде наступ, ідуть, значить, наркомани, бандити з деяких, котрих відпустили з Росії, дали амністію, щоб воювати. Бандити, в перемешку трохи з населенням, котре пішло за гроші, нема виходу, і вони цих людей вони пускають в першу чергу. Вони гинуть, їх ніхто не рахує, кидає в шпиталі, ну не шпиталі, кидає прямо на поле бою. Вони їх навіть не рахують, вони їдуть по ними танками та залишають на поле бою.
Це наркоми, бандити,
кримінали,
і найомники.
І змішані найомники, котрі проживають на території.
He's been asked this, and so he put some of these thoughts down on Facebook, he said earlier, but he just to explain what happens first. They've encountered a lot of people who openly declare that they are criminals from Russia who have been given amnesty if they go to fight in Ukraine, as well as people who rightly should be in some kind of rehab clinic, and then on top of that you have the locals who have been giving money. They among the troops of Ukraine, they refer to these people as mercenaries, not in the classical sense of warriors, strong, but people who are basically fighting because they have no other options and they're giving money. Now he wants to make clear that these are the people who they send first into a firefight, and in his estimation. In his estimation, they do not even count their deaths. They are just chattel to be sent into the battlefront.
Потім з ними вони йдуть перші. Чому ми дуже бачимо, наприклад, мало полонених військових Російської Федерації? Тому що вони йдуть позаду. І після того, як пішли ці, йдуть російські військові, вже йде регулярна армія, котра їх підтримує артилерією, танками та підтримує вогнем. Їх теж не рахують, ну, відвозять до шпиталі, ну, як сказав Тимашу Лажукова, да, що жінки ще народжають, тому вони то теж не дуже, ти можеш так і перекласти.
So first you send this chattel in, these criminals, people who should be, in rehab clinics, and people who are paying off. As far as he can tell, their bodies are just left there. Nobody's claiming any dog tags. Nobody's really marking these deaths. And that's why you're not getting a lot of recorded Russian soldier deaths, even though we hear those stories. But one reason that you don't have a lot of these recorded Russian deaths is because they send these other people to take the brunt of the fire. And then behind them is regular Russian military, which his battalion has encountered in the field, regular Russian military, with or without markings on it. And they... And then they, whatever of those people are injured, they will take to a hospital. Whatever those people die, they're the ones that you hear buried under cover of night in Russia.
Are they really the occupying force then?
Would you call them an occupying force? Was that the question?
The regular Russians, that's really an occupying force.
Так, то російські війська це є окупанти, справді, так? Ви б назвали їх?
Можна так назвати і скажу, що Росія веде агресію, потрібно називати все своїми словами. Це російські війська воюють на території України, це найомники з російської сторони, вони ведуть гібридну війну, але потрібно зараз світу визнати одне, що Росія веде війну з Україною. Це зараз тільки з Україною. Якщо світ не надасть допомоги Україні, війна піде далі, на Прибалтику, на інші країни Європи. І коли світ позанехтується і не думає про надати допомогу, буде мати велику проблему. Путін не залишить не Україну, не Європу.
He believes in calling things for what they are. So if you're acting by occupier, yes, they are. You should call this a war. You should call this a war of aggression by Russian soldiers, by the mercenaries who are being bought off to kill Ukrainians. and that's what we should be talking about this in those terms, a war of aggression on Ukrainian territory, because if it's not stopped right now, if the rest of the world doesn't send any kind of support to Ukraine, then he will just continue taking more Ukrainian territory, and then the rest will follow, whether it's the Baltics, whether the rest of NATO territory. Ivan feels that if the West doesn't support Ukraine now, and make Ukraine the place where you stop his advance, he will only go further.
На сьогоднішній час...
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree with you more, but let me ask you guys a question.
Yeah.
Is the Ukraine army essentially outgunned? Are they in full support of the volunteer battalions? Why do we have volunteer battalions? Right? Is it because the Ukrainian army is not fully in the fight? What is the best strategy for Ukraine right now? How can Ukraine improve its strategy? I mean, I know that the U.S. and needs to send weapons, and we need to get NATO more involved. But lacking all of that, what is the optimal strategy from an on the ground perspective in the Donbass?
Яку найліпшу стратегію зараз тепер? Де є українське саме військо? Чому волонтери тепер воюють перше, а не окреме військо? Що є стратегія? Він розуміє, що треба допомогу НАТО і зброї і так далі. Але що саме військо має тепер робити на вашій думці?
Ну, по-перше, чому воюють волонтерські батальйони? Тому що коли їх створили, взагалі армії не було. Янукович і за ці часи армія українська була повністю знищена в прямому сенсі.
So first of all, why the battalions are fighting? The battalions came into being before the full army had an ability to mobilize in the east. That's quite simply, there was no command structure to deploy people in a way that was really going to engage with foreign forces, and the battalion system, this way of doing volunteer battalions, was the only way to get people up against foreign force right away.
Тому батальйони взяли на себе частину то, що не змогла і не спроможна була робити армія, по-перше. І зараз батальйони стали неот'ємлемою частиною української армії. Зараз всі батальйони війшли до складу ЗСУ, Збройних сил України, і координовано працюють разом з Генеральним штабом української армії. Координовано.
So right now, since that time where the volunteer battalions were the first ones to be able to mobilize into a fight, they have all gone under the armed and become members of the armed forces of Ukraine. A member of a volunteer battalion takes the same oath of military that a Ukrainian soldier would take. They're all included within the military structure. They get their commands from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. So he's just explaining what the lay of the land is right now.
Don't they need a draft? Don't they need mandatory enlistment? The country's being invaded.
Чи треба, щоб загальну мобілізацію мали, чи щоб ціла країна вислала своїх молодих?
На мою думку, у нас дуже добрі військові. Ми можемо воювати. Ми потребуємо, по-перше, це реформування, термінове реформування армії. Це заміна старого составу Генерального штабу. Тому що, на мою думку, всі втрати і некомпетентність старих генералів – це є велика проблема. Це перше. Це зміна составу і навчання. Чому ми потребуємо не тільки військової допомоги надати нам зброю, але ми потребуємо і просимо навчання, дати інструкторів, дати фахівців, відправити з Генерального штабу на навчання, тому що ми дуже багато генералів старої школи. Я не кажу, що вони погані, але потрібно надавати сучасну освіту. Потрібно втілювати на сучаснішу тактичну медицину. Це перше.
So for in terms of wanting to get in the fight, it's not. There's no lack of wanting to get people to fight for Ukraine. In terms of getting the soldiers who want to fight, the problems, from a soldier on the ground, is the fact that there needs to be a reform of the military system as well.
The structure of command.
Well, the structure of command, and he's specifically pointing out the fact that there are still generals and leaders in the defense ministry of Ukraine that work under the Soviet system in terms of their tactics, in terms of how they treat value human life. And it's not anything near the Western model in terms of tactical medicine, in terms of training, which is this is they're asking the West not only for weapons, but they're asking the West for medical supplies, medical helicopters, ways of getting that golden hour, and that doesn't really exist in Ukraine right now. So we need those field hospitals, but they also want training. They want training for their soldiers to be able to fight in these. For all intents and purposes, it's not a counterinsurgency, but it's definitely something that's coming at you within your own cities that you need to be able to defend against, and they simply don't have the tactics, but because they're thinking in a World War II mindset.
Я підкреслюю, що ми воюємо старою
Let me break in 1 second. For people who don't know what a golden triangle, golden hour is, please can you explain that?
Таке, да?
Так.
Золотий час – це в американської армії, коли солдат потрібен попасти з поля бою до шпиталю. Є золотий час в тактичної медицини, стандарти НАТО і США. В Україні солдат попадає поранений за 8 годин. Є різниця?
Wow. The golden hour is a tenet of United States warfare. I don't know if you would call it. I'm just quoting him. I don't know if you call it Western battlefield medicine, about the amount of time it takes for a soldier to get from the front to a secure medical facility. And frankly, he says in Ukraine, that's an 8-hour window at best of
right.
getting.
I mean, very, very simply, the golden hour is if you get wounded in the field, you need to get into a serious medical facility within an hour, and it saves a lot of lives that way. But I want to go back to something else you said about reforming the command structure. And I have a quote here from the BBC today from Semen Semenchenko, a member of the Ukrainian parliament who leads the volunteer Donbass battalion, told the BBC he blamed the fall of Debaltsev on the Ukrainian army command and called for it to be overhauled. Quote, I can assure you that we lost Debaltsev not because of the Russian military advantage, but because our generals refused to take responsibilities, unquote. What would be your comment on that?
Well, this is the same thing that Ivan was talking about. So we're not in any way talking about a coup or a military takeover of Ukraine, but in general in Ukraine, there is a sense of needing to reform our government structures, whether that's your border customs, whether that's your prosecutorial office, of which the general prosecutor was just dismissed the other week as part of the structure, as part of the system that Ukraine is undergoing throughout the last year of reforming all of its structures. And what Ivan mentioned specifically is the fact that the military structure is still run by these Soviet minds. And frankly, if you're going to be defending your homeland, you want the best tactics, the best military strategists, people who value lives more than others, more than your enemy values their own lives. And that's what's lacking in the military. I believe that's what Major Semenchenko was saying as well, in the fact that he's not advocating for a military takeover of Ukraine, but the fact that as the rest of society in Ukraine has fought against these old Soviet systems that we're finally shedding, so does the Ukrainian army need to go through that as well.
Has anyone talked about a coup in Ukraine? I mean, have there been any high-level discussions of that?
No, not at all. It's not even mentioned in the halls of parliament. Unless you're way out there radical, but in terms of what the society is thinking, that absolutely, that's not even part of the equation.
Ти про Семенченка, да, було питання, що вони зробили штаб, да?
Так.
Взагалі, я скажу думку свою.
He wants to add a little bit more about Semenchenko's quote.
Semenchenko and his proposition. Для мене, по-перше, взагалі, коли Генеральний штаб помилки робить, і президент не робить висновки з цього. Люди збираються, і саме це не паралельно, не потрібно лякатися цього, це перше. Це тільки буде штаб, сухопутні війська у нас мають свій штаб. морська піхота має свій штаб. Цей штаб тільки буде збирати тоді в цей штаб цю інформацію першу, це аналізувати все. Ну, він буде співпрацювати з Генеральним штабом. Ну, вони будуть співпрацювати. Це не потрібно лякатися, що буде. Це штаб, за котрий будуть...
So can you bring up that quote again, Anders, of Semenchenko? Did you have that up before?
Yeah. The quote is, "I can assure you that we lost Debaltseve not because of the Russian military advantage, but because our generals refused to take responsibility."
Yeah, and that's what that is what he's saying. And there was also a additional part of that is that he was proposing to have a secondary command structure within the active forces who are deployed in the east, because and what Ivan's pointing out is a lot of people are thinking, oh, this is what that word we mentioned, coup, right? This is these volunteer battalions trying to band together and trying to not listen to the Ministry of Defense. And he's saying, and Ivan is saying, no. For people who are thinking that, that's not the case. What this secondary, I wouldn't call it secondary, but it's underneath the head command structure. They want a level of accountability. That's what they want. So what the problem is the fact that Poroshenko, the president, again, I'm relaying Ivan's words from the battalion, Poroshenko is not holding anybody accountable enough in terms of the military structure. Whereas people have been fired in the prosecutor's office, etc., in the military command structure, nobody's being held accountable for their decisions. So what Semenchenko is saying is the same exact thing, only that he's proposing that the volunteer battalions verify all the information that they're getting and be able to point out exactly why the problem was that a military defeat happened, because he feels that if you don't hold people accountable, then the morale of the Corps is just not going to hold up.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I've heard from other people is that the military in Kiev, the military command structure, is actually quite corrupt, very connected to the Russian side in many instances. So the question arises for me, do you think that the Ukrainian people would appreciate would invite NATO forces in were NATO to be willing to do so? I know they're probably not willing to do so, but were they to be willing to do so, do you think the Ukrainian people would appreciate that?
Чи на вашій думці, як ви ми попросили НАТО вояків прийти, чи Україна би прийняла їх, щоб прийти і помогли, чи ні? Солдатів з НАТО?
Для мене, як військового, так, дуже було б добре мати таку підтримку взаємодії з військами НАТО, тому що взагалі нам важко протистояти зараз проти російської машини, котра використовує найпотужнішу техніку, сучасні танки та інше. Тому для військових, на мою думку, це було би добре. Для людей, для простих українців і для гражданських, вони втомилися від війни. Вони тільки мріють і живуть, коли все це закінчиться. Тому більшість людей свідомо, щоб закінчити цю війну, вона закінчиться, і ви це побачите. Тільки коли у нас буде потужна армія, і ми дамо відсіч ворогу. Інакше Путін, він тільки відчуває силу. Ці люди не ми вже програли всю дипломатію, і Євросоюз, і Америка, і ми бачимо тільки зараз перемогу Путіна на Україні. І це потрібно визнати, і він не буде зупинятися.
So, from the opinion of a soldier, they would absolutely welcome that extra support of having NATO soldiers fighting alongside, giving them the extra support. In terms of you're asking it, would the nation open up for that? And he reports that the nation is pretty much getting demoralized with this war, because it's just defeat after defeat. It's territory after territory that's being taken. What the leadership says in terms of they're going to defend something, and ends up being, withdrawal, not only on the battlefield, but then the same thing with the diplomatic and treaties with Russia. The difference between Minsk I and Minsk II, it's even more giving up of what Ukraine had to Russia. So he feels that the nation itself needs something to stand behind, and it's not until the military is able to put some wins on the scorecard or something for the whole nation to be rallied behind. Because right now he feels that the rest of the nation is feeling demoralized by the fact that there haven't been any good outcomes so far.
Right. I mean, I was actually discussing the Ukraine issue with a Latvian friend recently, and she's moving out of the country and trying to move her family out of the country because she's worried about Putin and the danger that Putin presents to the Baltic countries. So I think it's far beyond just the Ukraine. It's the danger to the Baltics. It's the danger to Poland. Southeast Europe. It's really a big danger to all of us. And I'm. So, Bob, can you tell us, what's your opinion about what should we be doing here?
Well, I think we've got to do much tougher economic sanctions to directly affect Putin and the people around him. As with most dictators, they don't really care that much about how much pain the general public is suffering. It's how much pain they're suffering. Another thing is, I think you've got to give the Ukrainians defensive arms. I no doubt about that. Especially anti-tank weaponry, anti-artillery tools, that sort of thing. I don't think it is politically possible for NATO to send troops directly, a large number of troops, but certainly the Ukrainian defense establishment could use much more assistance in the way of training and advice from experienced military people in NATO, especially the United States is overwhelmingly the main force in NATO. The Western Europeans have been kind of coasting in their NATO.
Bob, can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah. Again, I think you need much tougher economic sanctions to directly affect Putin and his sort of mobsters around him that run the Russian regime. The other thing I think you need is you need just repeating myself here. You need direct defensive weaponry to be given to the Ukrainians, and you need much more advice to be provided to them to the Ukrainian defense establishment.
Now, Ivan, I have a question for you, and that is, would military or defensive weapons provided to Ukraine, would that actually be enough to stop Putin, or does it really require more? Do you need professional NATO forces in Ukraine to stop Putin?
Soldiers, generals, and so on. No, I just think that's not going to happen. I think it would work. Actually, you'd have something of a direct, maybe conventional war between NATO and Russia, which is pretty scary. But
well, I guess my question is for Ivan. Would better military materiel, basically, be enough to stop Putin, or do you actually need professional NATO military forces in there as a tripwire?
На мою думку, звісно, потрібен час нам, щоб навчати фахівців, надавати зброю, навчати людей. Це все час. Ми гаємо зараз час. Це перше. Тому, на мою думку, якщо б у нас була підтримка НАТО, це із області фантастики зараз, це неможливо, звичайно, тому що Європа не хоче втручатися в конфлікт і так далі. Но підтримка професійної армії, якщо б була і піхота, і прийшли, вже потрібно щось робити. Нема іншого, як не воювати з Путіним. Ми тільки світ даємо час. Ми бачимо другого Гітлера. І якщо ми не зупинимо його силою, нема гарантії, що він далі буде в Європі чи в странах Балтії. Тому, якщо Європа буде надалі грати в свої ігри, може так, Андрій, переведи, будь ласка, то НАТО будуть. Але, на мою думку, як фахівцю, Україні не тільки потрібна там зброя, але й потрібна, мабуть, війська, але це буде вже Третя світова війна, якщо вони окажуться у нас. Тому, по-перше, ми чекаємо інструкторів, фахівців і зброї, з котрі нас навчать, тому що ми воюємо технікою і зброєю 80-х, 70-х років.
Now, you can talk about supplies, you could talk about material, you could talk about soldiers. Frankly, the one thing in Ivan's mind that Ukraine needs most of all would be time. Ukraine needs time to develop itself, which it doesn't have. Of course, NATO soldiers would be fantastic to have fighting alongside or defending the border, but that's really a fantastic notion because really that would be the beginning of World War III. But Ukraine is in a position where it really doesn't have the luxury of time, and it doesn't have the luxury of not fighting back against Putin. There's no fight. There's no not giving a fight because he's just going to continue taking territory, and that's why they bring up the fact that this is very much in the same way of not respecting territorial integrity as in the World War II and the Hitler model of just taking what territory you want. So what he would like, yes. The fantastic thing would be the NATO soldiers, but we need time, and we need time to develop our soldiers. You start with the trainers, which the United States is going to be sending next month, and then you add in the extra supplies, the defensive weapons, but also these things that I was talking about, the military ambulances, the field hospitals, everything that working in concert can help the Ukrainian soldiers at least try to hold the line and slow down the advance. Because if we don't slow it now, it's just going to continue going.
The most useful defensive weaponry to send in now? Anti-tank stuff? What about airplanes?
Що би найважніше, як зброї вислати Україні? Чи то антитанк Javelin, чи то є літаки?
По-перше, ще раз я хотів нагадати, що Україна сьогодні воює зброєю 80-х років. 70-х, це перше, скажи.
Let's just keep in mind that Ukraine's army is fighting with material from the 70s and 80s. Just to make that clear for everybody.
I do want to say that I think that a NATO forces in Ukraine wouldn't necessarily start World War III. It's very frequent that superpower military forces come into contact, and all these superpowers know the dangers involved, and so they don't allow mild contact between their military forces to develop into nuclear war. And so I think that's that's a myth that I disagree with and want to point out. I think it is important to put your forces into play to some extent, at least on the field, not necessarily fighting, to show resolve and to show that you actually care about countries such as Ukraine.
Well, this is why Ukrainian advocates here in the United States, in Canada, and to a lesser extent in Europe, where they're not as organized as here, have been advocating for helping Ukraine with non-military supplies, with military supplies, because frankly now is when you need to make the stand. As Ambassadors Pfeiffer and Herbst today said at a discussion, if you're not going to do it when the largest country in the world invades the largest nation in Europe, when are you going to stop that country from invading and ever further? Because right now, Putin has invaded Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, three westernmost countries of his satellites that are broken off, not including those in NATO. So if you don't stop him now, the next countries are NATO countries that he would go to. Wouldn't you rather do it before you have to get to Article 5? Wouldn't you rather do your brinksmanship on a neutral territory like Ukraine, where you can again bring those people to the front and make a stand? It doesn't have to be like you're saying, Anders, a military stand, but at least have them there, that they know that if you go any further, then the aggressive party is the one who has the blame here.
Would they just abandon?
We're almost out of time. I just want to say, Ivan, thank you very much for joining us. If viewers want to know how they can help your battalion, what would they do to help you?
It's very simple. He has a Facebook page called Help the 25th Volunteer Battalion. So if you look on Facebook and it says,
you can find me, Ivan Rodichenko,
yeah,
in Facebook.
his
contact
Facebook
with
page,
me,
Ivan
and you can help
Rodichenko,
Ukraine Army.
and that has he's been using crowdsourcing here in the United States. Ivan himself is not an arms dealer. He supplies socks, uniforms for people, night vision goggles, helmets. So basic supplies for the soldiers. When he started, really, these people, when he showed up for the first day of training, they had not enough helmets to go around, and what helmets they had were from World War II. They had metal helmets. So really, he's about outfitting his guys as best as possible before they get into the into combat. And the government of Ukraine is in charge of deploying arms to the battalions, all these volunteers that you hear about. This is not people buying arms on eBay or something.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bob. Thank you. Do you have any last words, Bob?
Yeah, I think just a last question, which is, wouldn't there be a temptation to simply abandon the Donbass and then defend the rest of the Ukraine, perhaps with NATO assistance?
Well,
it's too late to get rid of the Russians from the Donbass.
Right. There's a lot of accountability that needs to happen. I think the end game really here is going to have to be justice and accountability of some sort. Yeah. And that really happens not now, but in the next decade or so, whenever Putin comes to his eventual end. So, this is not just a Ukraine fight. Georgia has been assaulted. This is now the 7th conflict zone that Russian troops are involved with actively right now. Whether you're talking about the dispute with the Kuril Islands in Japan, you're talking about Moldova, Georgia. So this isn't so much a Ukraine problem; it's a world problem to deal with. And that's really when we're going to have to, the justice is going to come in the end at some point. In the meantime, we're trying to save lives.
Я хотів сказати останнє, крайніше, що Путіна лише можна тільки остановити силою. Ніяка дипломатія не буде з ними працювати. І ви це побачите. Це загроза. Путін воює не з Україною. Він воює з НАТО. І для нього ворог – це НАТО. І він буде дестабілізувати ситуацію в Європі, розвалити Євросоюз і посіяти на європейському континенті, посіяти війну і хаос. Це його завдання зараз. Повністю зруйнувати європейську систему.
One last point from Ivan is that Putin is already involved in a proxy war. Ukraine is just a proxy for him to fight against NATO. To weaken NATO, to seed chaos throughout the European Union, and to bring the rest of the world down to the level of standards that Russia has right now. So we're already involved in a war that's way beyond Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Well said. Andrij, thank you very much. Ivan,
Andrij,
good luck. Bob, thank you.
Thank you so much.
We're signing off now. Thank you.
Thank you so much.